Welcome to the Combat Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Peacock. My guest today is Bruce Hoyer, head coach at the Next Edge MMA Academy and an innovator in BJJ practice design. In this episode, we talk about his unique flipped classroom model approach to running BJJ classes and designing curriculum, as well as how coaches can use technology to enhance their training programs. The material in this episode is a lot of fun to think about, so if you're excited to jump in, hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcatcher now. How did you get into motor learning and coaching science?
Sure. First of all, my name is Bruce Hoyer. I've been training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for about 19 years. Was originally from South Dakota, but I've moved all over the Midwest. Was absolutely terrible at jiu-jitsu for the first couple of years of training, and so I just decided that I was going to go out and still compete and train everywhere that I could, and ended up kind of starting pretty much I think like the second Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu podcast way back when. So I think Bite Works was the first one ever, and then we were the second with BJJ Connect. And while that was a little bit of a failure in the fact that it, as most podcasts go, it becomes super labor intensive, but it allowed me to go and train with a lot of people, high level guys, especially back then. This is probably, 2003, 2004, where, anytime any, black belt could get a little bit of notoriety or an interview, things like that, they were trying to, because they were trying to build up their brand and their name. And so it allowed me to train with a lot of, like I said, really well-known guys back then. And so it was kind of nice. And so, but I started getting a little bit better in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, managed to win a world championship at purple belt, did very well regionally at like IBJJF tournaments at brown. And then I've won a couple tournaments at black. But I've, never won an IBJJF tournament at black belt. But I've had the chance to, we had our instructor here for the longest time, but he ended up moving down to Arizona. And so I kind of picked up where he left off, and that's where I started teaching. And since then it's been under Rodrigo Medeiros, or better known as Compredo, out of Chicago. So going to there to train with him as much as possible, or bringing him out here. So that's how I got started in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And then after that, I'd been coaching for, almost 5 or 6 years. And I decided that, okay, I want to start figuring out a way to make this better, because one of the things that was super frustrating for me as a coach was either I had to teach something that was semi-basic to students so everybody could get a feel for it. And granted, like, I think it's always good to polish up on basics, but some of the advanced folks would be a little bit bored with it. And then if I taught something that was a little bit more complex, it was the newer students were becoming super, were struggling with it super hard, or would become annoyed with like so many steps from this. And so that kind of grew like a fascination with me of trying to figure out how to make a better class for everybody. And so, I think some coaches take care of it by doing a beginner, intermediate, and advanced class. And for me, like, that was a struggle, because I wanted my students to learn from my other students. And I feel like everybody should be able to go to any class available. And so I wanted to figure out how to incorporate all those things.
And so that led you into looking at research and things like that.
So I read, I probably have more books on, motor learning and coaching and learning than jiu-jitsu, honestly. And so, I really delved into those and said, okay, what can we take this? And I think a lot of it is definitely theory, and it's tough to make happen in a real world scenario. But to the annoyment of a lot of the students that I have, started going through different iterations of, okay, how can we change this around to make this work? I think my students for a while were getting annoyed there, because I was changing stuff every week, trying to see if it was better. And in hindsight, that's probably not a very good test, in the fact that I did it for, a week, and I was like, oh, this worked or this failed or whatever. But yeah, so I just started kind of with classes format, if you will, for a long time from then. So
very cool. So you're known for
applying the flipped class model to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. What is the flipped class model, and how does it work with martial arts?
Sure. So the flipped classroom style would be, at its whole, for like, if we were to talk about it in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu terms, taking all the instruction out of the class and putting it mostly in their off time. And so, like, if you're a regular student, think of doing like the watching everything at home, the lesson portion of it, and doing all the homework there. So I really like that idea because a lot of times with parents now, the students are doing, say they're doing calculus or something like that. You take that home and you can't work on it because it's, your parent doesn't know how to do that. And so it's nice. It seemed like a relevant model to me in the fact that, like, if you, just like if you were home and you could try to figure out calculus, and if you struggle with it, you're doing it there in class. And that's what I'm trying to do on the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu side. We recorded pretty much all of our lesson plans, or maybe I'll use a video from YouTube, which is, previously that was like a complete no-no by instructors. Like, never look at YouTube because it's always some guy rolling around in the grass and he doesn't know what he's talking about. But now,
right,
you go on there and it's just a plethora of high-level instructors. I mean, you cannot get like that level of quality anywhere else, I think, unless you were to travel all the time and get the, that many different opinions and that many different ways of doing something, and kind of finding everybody's little secret. So it's super nice. So the practical side of it is we have all of our students watch what I want them learning beforehand. And so when they come in class, they should just be replicating in that. And so when we first started, it was like 15-minute videos of me talking about this ad nauseum of this technique. And so now I had to slowly bring those down. And so now it's like maybe a 2-minute video that they can just keep rewatching. And then what we've done on top of that is made like a little 10-second GIF of just the technique for them to reference during the class. But my hope is, and what usually happens most of the time, is they'll watch the videos beforehand, and then when they come in, they just have the entire day to work on those things and kind of tinker, rather than listen to me talk for 20 minutes as I try to instruct. So.
Yeah, for sure. And I know even good instructors sometimes fall into the trap of over teaching, like just way too much detail, going off on tangents, and we get excited because we love this stuff. So if we want to coach, we want to teach, we really go into like super in depth. But that I'm sure you'll agree that probably inundates students too much. They just want to know the idea so they can kind of start figuring it out.
What's funny is Keenan was talking about that on, Josh Hinger, who I had the pleasure, I cannot talk to, the pleasure of training with a couple weeks ago. Him and Keenan were talking about that a couple weeks ago, where Keenan was like, man, he's like, before I had this, like, when he was a blue belt, he was trying to show other white belts how to learn or how to, do certain moves. And when he was a purple belt, he was trying to do that. And, he went on to say, he's like, I think that's a terrible idea. You shouldn't learn from lower belts. And I disagree. I think, honestly, in my opinion, the blue belts should be showing the white belts, the purple belts should be showing the blue belts, and it should be just like a constant sharpening of a sword, rather than because from everything that I've read as far as learning, I'm actually the worst person to teach somebody, because I have so much knowledge that when I try to say, okay, let's do armbar, like you said, I give them too much information where it's okay, you have to do this, 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 and this. And really what it should be is like, okay, you'll get this, 25%. Once you get that 25% correct, then move on. Now you're going to get 35%, rather than trying to get 100% every single time. So I think that creates it. What I'm trying to do is have that with the students. So for the most part, I'm walking around and making sure that everything looks correct. But the other students are mostly, the senior students are helping out newer students. And then if the senior student has a question, they can ask me. But it should be kind of a trickle down process, so everybody gets a little bit better, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And I used to be the same way. It's like you have to have a qualified instructor for every aspect of instruction. It has to be 100% correct detail, XYZ. But are you familiar with the concept of social learning?
No.
Okay, so that sounds exactly to me like a concept called social learning. And that's kind of, that's it's involved with motor learning, but I kind of discovered it kind of more in a classroom learning kind of setting. Um, Basically, the idea behind social learning is that your relationship with your instructor is different than your relationship with your peers, and for whatever reason, your learning actually tends to become more rapid and more impactful if you learn a lot from your peers instead of whoever's the learning or instructional authority. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but it's awesome. And I thought you were actually listening to the way you've set up your classroom structure. I thought you were actually familiar with that term. So that's what it sounds like to me, that you've actually built a community of learning, where you can leverage the principle of social learning because you have so many peers at different levels that can actually help and come alongside your newer students, or really students at any level, and
Right.
help them along to their position.
Yeah, and that's, it's funny that like when I watch a technique of somebody do it and I say, okay, let me see that technique. It's crazy to me the amount of anxiety that a student has by, okay, now they're being watched by the instructor rather than, like you said, another peer, to where they feel like they can make quite a few more mistakes and clean it up if a peer is looking at it compared to me, which I don't understand. Maybe I come off too harshly when I make corrections or something, but I think that's probably most students, and the fact that if your teacher was looking at it compared to if another student was looking at it, the level of difference that of anxiety that you would have. So
Yeah, I think anxiety probably definitely plays into that equation. I know that. So I used to teach children a lot, and I had a much more, I don't know how to describe it. I wasn't strict like a lot of traditional martial artists are. I taught Taekwondo,
sure.
and a lot of the instructors had more of a bad cop kind of thing to them, and I was the good cop. That was my instructional style. So I had a very big brother type of relationship with my students. They talked to me a lot. They wanted to come up and tell me how their day was as soon as they came in, and they wanted to talk my ear off after class and everything. So I felt like it was a really low pressure, low anxiety kind of format, but still, um, it's still like, even with that relationship, they didn't want to let me down. So it was still like more anxiety if I came by and was like, "Hey, show me the technique. I want to see what you're doing." Eh, As opposed to another student, maybe a little older, a little higher level, like, "Hey, do this or that," where it's more of like a playful situation and there's way less um, anxiety, as you said, or less expectations on
Right.
the situation. So I think that's definitely a part of it. And there's probably other things that I don't know about that are involved with it. I think I've only read one book on social learning. It's definitely something I would like to research more, but I just thought that was really interesting. I wanted to call that out.
Yeah, no, I think you're 100%, right on in the fact that like that's something that we definitely tried to do, whether I knew it, or not. But that's my guess is that through reading we've they just didn't maybe use the term, but definitely had the same idea. So
Yeah, definitely. A lot of these really research-based concepts, they they mesh into each other because
mhm.
they're logically related, because we're all trying to find, how do humans learn? What's
Right,
the general trend in how humans tend to learn?
right,
And so eventually you're going to have a lot of overlap.
yeah, I agree.
So I'm actually interested to know, what other procedures or strategies do you have that you use to enhance and support the flipped classroom model?
So we've kind of gone through a couple different versions of this, if you will. So when we started, it was all the instructionals were on a website, or actually the first one was through Evernote. And so when we went through Evernote, every day I would go in and I would update the students' lesson plan, saying, "Okay, go ahead and do this, and then this, and then this." And so that got to be a little bit of a cumbersome process, and so we switched to an online WordPress LMS, and I thought that would be great. And I think the other problem that we ran into is when students tried to look on the website, maybe their password went bad, or they struggled to get on there. Um, we try to make it easier and easier. So our next version, our latest version, is we just have everything on a Google document, a curriculum that starts as a schedule from top to bottom, and everybody kind of goes through those, and so they get access to a Google Drive folder, and then they're looking through those things. And so each lesson plan has a little bit of the gifts on it, and then moves from there. So we've slowly tried to add in some of the timing stuff. So in other words, so maybe that first day they might go through concepts. So then a lot of it is concept based. So the second day might be sweeps from a particular position like close guard. Third day might be passes. Fourth day might be submissions. And then they're going through a fifth day of reviewing, and then trying to change some of those things that they've learned together. And then that within that self, like the position, those will rotate every once in a while as well. And so we want to get in spaced repetition. I know that that's a key thing as well. So you'll see some of those positions, they'll be going back to those after a certain amount of time, usually like we're hoping for like a month, and then also going through those for like a 7 days at a time usually. And so between the spaced repetition and then also just the format that we do, that's a lot of what we're trying to put in place, I think.
Cool. And spaced repetition, for those who don't know what that is, could you explain that briefly?
Sure. So the idea is that, in my opinion, like I said, I'm not claiming to be an expert, but that say if somebody were to do an armbar from guard, I want them working on that for like a week. And then if you go a little bit later, I want it to have a little bit of a degree of like failure, or to like have that be slightly incorrect later. And so then when they repeat it again, it has to activate the brain and say, okay, how do I do this again? And so whether that be 2 weeks or a month later, I still think we're working on that precise timing of it. And I think it'll be a little bit different for everybody. And they're based on how much they, how well they are at that particular technique. But being able to, hit like an armbar from close guard solid for a couple days, and then giving it a little bit of a rest, and then coming back to it later to see if you remember it. And then, for me, actually, the hope is that you made a few mistakes in there, we correct those, and then move on later. And so, because I think a lot of my students struggle with the idea of like me actually being okay with them having a little bit of a struggle, because if they come in and they can't quite remember how to do something, that tells me, that we don't quite have it in there yet. And so that should also give them a little bit of anxiety. If they have a little bit of anxiety about not knowing that technique, then it makes the brain try to remember it that much more, determines that it's important, and then they're trying to, obviously you're going to be able to remember that a little bit more the next time. So.
Very cool. So traditionally, instructors seem to be kind of obsessed with perfecting technique immediately. They want to break down every move in a way that lets you do it successfully through like a progression of steps, because they don't want to see those mistakes.
Right.
And it kind of, I guess it hampers your ability to explore the technique and kind of discover things on your own. And on the Perception and Action podcast, I've heard the host call this errorless learning. And it seems like a lot of these really traditional ideas around learning, whether they have been studied by instructors, instructors seem to like totally fall in line with all these really traditional old ideas about teaching. Because your system is based around spaced learning and a degree of exploration, I was wondering why you decided to move away from the traditional errorless learning model of instruction.
Because in some of the learning, I actually think a lot of this, a couple episodes of the same podcast that you were talking about, I think there's really no like perfect technique for like each thing. I think it's going to be a perfect technique for each person. And so I think they need to actually figure that out a little bit for themselves. And if they do that, that makes a whole lot more sense to them. So like a reference of this would be if you go out there and you're training and you figure out this new, you know, way on how to do an arm bar, or, you know, how, all these crazy, you know, leg entanglements that you'll see somebody do a crazy series. Because, you know, in their eyes, that was not an intrinsic learning scenario, but like a intrinsic learning. They, like, I feel like they adhere to that a little bit more, and they understand it better. They, you know, they feel like that's really theirs. And so with that, you know, if I can get my students to do that, the chances of them being able to remember it should be a lot higher, just because they feel like they kind of figure that out rather than, you know, having to be told it.
Yeah. So, so a strange thing that the Perception and Action podcast kind of keeps highlighting a lot is that didactic or direct instruction seems to lead to more, I guess you would they call it noise. So for whatever reason, it's usually more effective to kind of figure a technique out by yourself if you're able than it is to be told, because your attention is divided in a lot of different directions, and the way that you internally conceptualize a technique might be different from one person to the next. And the way that you teach the technique sometimes could be based on your own internal, I don't know what to call it, mapping of how to
Right.
execute the technique in your own internal timing, where it actually might be better to let the person make a lot of mistakes in pursuit of their own way of doing the technique, or their own way of understanding it internally.
Yeah. And, you know, honestly, like, being 100% honest, you know, if other coaches are looking at this method, that's one of the struggles that I have. And so really the two big struggles that I have are getting students to learn, like, look at stuff beforehand, which is crazy to me. Like, I feel like almost like, and I talk to my students about this all the time. Like, they are constantly on Instagram and YouTube looking at other techniques. I'm like, my videos and some of the other videos that I point to are like 2 minutes long. Like, you have 8 minutes in your day in order to like look at this stuff, or at least you should. But the other big one is that I do point to that a lot, where, you know, if I want this student to figure it out a little bit more themselves, I'm going to try to help them through the process. But I'd really like to do less, like, you know, okay, so what we're going to do is this, and this. It's okay. Well, why, you know, why do you think we want this? And so it's a lot of why questions. And I think a lot of the students really get annoyed with that.
Hey, sorry to interrupt you right in the middle of the podcast, but I promise it'll only take a second. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Combat Learning email newsletter at combatlearning.com/newsletter. Not only will you never miss an episode of the Combat Learning podcast, you'll get exclusive tips and resources straight to your inbox. And I'm giving away my ebook, An Introduction to Motor Learning for Martial Artists, so you can get up to speed on the central topics of this podcast. But that's not even it. I'll also invite you to our private Facebook discussion group so you can ask any questions you want or discuss any topic related to teaching and learning martial arts. And all of this is 100% free. So go to combatlearning.com/newsletter right now to subscribe and claim all this cool stuff for yourself. That's combatlearning.com/newsletter.
But my goal behind this is so that they can get a greater understanding of it. But it definitely does not help. Like, sometimes I feel like, you know, just like with my other instruction, I think students want to come in, not have to think sometimes, and then just be able to replicate techniques and say, yep, I feel good about myself. And then they get to roll, and then they get to go home. You know, there's not much actual thinking involved. And that's, you know, I definitely think you can improve from that. But I think once you figure out how to make it, you know, quite a few techniques work and how they work, I think that makes you so much better on the mats. And so, but the only struggle with it is the fact that asking students to do this continually, I think sometimes is annoying. So, to students,
It is a lot, and this is not based on research. This is more of an opinion of mine from a observation. And even though these sort of techniques we're talking about seem to result in better learning outcomes, it seems to be based that this is actually how humans learn better. People almost have to be untrained
right?
from the way that they've been, I guess, inculcated educational value. So they actually prefer and expect a very instructor-led didactic model, even though they learn better through another model. So they get upset, which is actually not good for learning.
Right.
It's a little bit of a catch-22, but
Yep.
they get upset because they perceive. I wrote an entire article on this. They perceive good instruction as highly detailed and involved instruction, even though that's not good for their learning process.
Right. Yeah. And it's, like I said, I agree. Once that student gets upset, cortisone goes up, and then all of a sudden they can't, or cortisol goes up, and then they can't, it's hard for them to retain anything anymore. But yeah, it's definitely, in a perfect world for me, if we could go back to a little bit of a apprenticeship model where, okay, they try something, and then the master worker kind of looks at that and says, no, go ahead and, fix this, fix that. And then just keep on tinkering and making it slightly better, I think is probably a better model. But yeah, I agree. I think most students are used to the idea of, sitting in front of a classroom and regurgitating a lot of the information that the instructor is giving out. So
yeah, and they expect if something goes wrong, they expect to look at the instructor and get an immediate answer, which is not always the optimal way to get feedback.
right. Yeah, and it's nice in the fact that while I am kind of doing that same stuff, it's I think they are starting to get the point of, I want them to try to figure it out, because they, for the most part, there's, jiu-jitsu is super vast, but if you look at it, okay, you've got, extension submissions, you've got compression submissions, you've got rotational submissions. That's really about, it. And so if you can delve it down to that concept, you can figure out most, submissions or sweeps. You've got, a couple different situations. If you can kind of figure out the mechanics like those, and, Kid Dale talks about that same stuff all the time. And, him and I have had those same conversations where I think, his system and my system could work really well together. But if they could step back and say, okay, conceptually, why is this armbar not working? Or, conceptually, why is this triangle not working? So I think that's, they're starting to do a lot of that, and that makes me happy. But I still get quite a few students that are, okay, just tell me the answer. So it reminds me of the Joe Rogan podcast when, oh gosh, Danaher was on.
Danaher?
Yep. And so
Yeah.
he's like, well, what do you see, Joe Rogan? And he's like, and you could see Joe Rogan visibly getting annoyed by that, because he's like, I don't know. So, and so Danaher was trying to pull information out of him. And Joe Rogan got a little bit frustrated, I think, in the fact that he didn't know what he was asking for. So I think that was a little bit half in the fact of okay, maybe Danaher was not asking an appropriate question, but then also I think he was trying to pull information out of him, and maybe Joe was not quite familiar with it. So
yeah, and Joe is very knowledgeable about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So
for sure,
it was a really interesting episode for me, because even though he is such a knowledgeable martial artist, he was not prepared to step into an analyst type of mindset and give the information that John was looking for.
Go
ahead.
I think, we're definitely coming of the age of specialists, I think. And so John is very much a really wealth of knowledge in a bunch of different places. But I feel like a lot of people were super behind in the leg entanglement stuff. So if you were to ask him, okay, what do you see from an armbar perspective? I think that would be one thing compared to, I think, the leg entanglement game for somebody that's been training for 20 years like myself, or Joe Rogan as well, is sort of new. And so we feel like we should have this knowledge, but it's such a niche area that's obviously it's grown in the last few years. So now, as an instructor, if you don't have that information, I feel like you're behind, way behind. But I feel like that's the struggle, is that Danaher has such a wealth of knowledge in that subject, because he's really dove into that 100%. And so somebody like Joe Rogan and previously some of the other instructors out there were just not super aware of some of those yet.
Yeah, and I've been doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu on and off for like the past 4 or 5 years. I'm still a white belt because I haven't been
Sure.
consistent, but I'm just now getting into the leg lock stuff. I haven't. I train at a Tom DeBlas affiliate now, and I was training it more. I guess you could say traditional Gracie style kind of
Hmm.
gyms before, like a guy that used to train. I learned from a guy who is affiliated with Roberto Traven, I think his name was, and he came
Yep.
from Gracie Baja, so we used the Gracie Baja curriculum. And then I trained at a Gordo affiliate. I trained at Lucas Lepri's academy, which was awesome. It was I loved training there, and I had to leave unfortunately because I got a job like way far away. Um, but there wasn't a lot of like I think I learned a straight ankle lock.
Right.
There was not a lot of leg positioning, not a lot of leg submissions. And when we did learn leg submissions, we actually didn't do a lot with like positioning, like the ashigarami leg entanglement
Hmm.
position, which is probably, I think, one of the keys to John Danaher's success is his ability to break down the position that leads up to the submission itself.
Right. Yeah,
So
and
that's been
you know,
really interesting.
as a coach too, that was something that all of a sudden, like, to me, technology is really changing the sport more than anything I've ever seen. Where it's, like I said before, you can go on and see high level instruction to where, 10 years ago when I was competing, if you had a series of techniques, or if you had, some specialty, you could keep that and compete in very well, and keep that information to yourself for the longest time. And now that's not the case. I mean, it seems like 1 or 2 months, and then all of a sudden everybody kind of understands, okay, you can do this, this, and this. And, like, I think the leg entanglement stuff, I think a lot of older coaches wanted to try to stay away from it as much as possible, but now it's, you have to include it in your curriculum. And I think some students, before it was like, okay, or I should say as coaches, like you said, okay, we're going to do straight ankle locks, but that's it. But now it's, if you, especially with so many tournaments out there that are submission only, and different rule sets, and some of the rule sets where as a white belt you can do a straight ankle lock, or you can do a heel hook or a knee bar, you have to pretty much show white belts earlier and earlier, leg lock at least leg lock defense, not necessarily maybe leg locks, but leg lock defense at least.
Oh, for sure. We have a similar issue in Olympic style Taekwondo with a lot of old school guys who wish it was like it was in the good old days.
Mm-hmm.
They refuse to teach some of the techniques that they don't like from where competition is now, the new school stuff, to
Mm-hmm.
to where Taekwondo has evolved as a sport. And an example of that technique is the what's called the cut kick. And a cut kick is basically just a lead leg
Yep.
side kick that can be used in a variety of different ways. It's a lot quicker than like a nice fully chambered side kick. And it's compared to like your really controlled aesthetic traditional technique, it's a little uglier, but methodologically it's very useful. And with the dawn of the ihogu, the electric chess gear that helps keep score, it's become necessary to compete at an elite level. And instructors, some of them are coming around because they're realizing that their students now can't even win on a local level, which is that's pretty bad if you can't even win at a local level.
Sure.
But a lot of them are just they refuse because it's like that's not traditional technique. That's not a real Taekwondo technique. I don't care about the sport. I don't care about the sport enough to actually help my students to be competitive and go out there and improve and do that, which, if you have students that really want to compete, that hurts them.
Right. And that's, like right now, I mean, it's very much the case. If you were to, some white belt or blue belt goes out and buys, let's say the Danaher series, of leg locks, that's a fairly in-depth system to where if somebody were to go out there, as a white or a blue belt, if that other white or blue belt didn't know how to stop a lot of that stuff, I mean, he's going to be able to win at a very high level in those, or I should say for local tournaments, he should be able to do very well just because he's, created a little bit of a niche in that, in his skill set. So.
Yeah, for sure. So you talked about a little bit about technology, and I wanted to ask you, how can instructors start using technology to help them teach more effectively?
I think at a whole, or even at a minimum, I should say, I think it would be better for instructors to start at least videotaping their instruction if they didn't want to go over to this full model. Being able to videotape some of their instruction beforehand, and then being able to give it to the students beforehand, so they're a little bit primed for when they come in and do that in class. They've already done that. So if some of the students want to go off to the side and start doing the technique while the other class is done, going through the instruction, that way, those students that do have the time beforehand, they can start to learn some of that. And then one of the other big things, we try to videotape pretty much all of our rolling sessions, because like you've probably heard it a lot of times, the way you remember the roll is completely different from the way it is. And so now with being able to have a cell phone or a GoPro, or we just honestly use a couple webcams, being able to put those up on YouTube as an unlisted video for our students, so they can go home and watch them later, so they can, okay, so how did he get me in this armbar, or how did he do this before, like taking it 2 or 3 steps back and doing that. One of the other big things I think would be good for students and good for coaches is, figure out some way, whether it be through Google Drive or Evernote or what, but have students be able to give you goals, in my opinion, kind of 3 levels. So if that student can think of, okay, who am I, who's a lot better than me in class than when I roll with, who is competitive with me, and who am I way better than? And so having 3 goals set up for those, either for the week or for the month, and saying, okay, with a person that's way better than me, okay, how can I work my defensive stuff? Can I do guard retention stuff? Can I do something to where, even though I'm going to most likely lose in that situation, can I get some wins out of trying to get into, okay, he had inside control and I was able to get into guard or get back something. And then the competitive person continually trying to refine their main game. That if you go out there and compete, what their main game would be, and then on that person that they're brand new with, or that I should say that they're quite a bit better than, trying to, okay, what things can I add into the game to my game this time? Because I think that's one of the biggest things that students struggle with. I think, especially, I know this is true in sparring, both in, Muay Thai and boxing and MMA, that you go into these, rolling sessions or, MMA sparring rounds, things like that, without a true goal in mind. You're just operating on whatever your normal game is. And I think you can do so much better if you, say beforehand, okay, can I make this happen? And so, like, there's not really a way to quantify, for the most part, jiu-jitsu stuff. You can say, okay, I got 7 arm bars this time, but that's only if you put that goal in, beforehand. Because it's nice if you lift weights and you say, okay, yesterday I lifted, 130 pounds. Today I lifted 135 pounds. I'm obviously getting better. But in jiu-jitsu, it's tough sometimes to quantify results. And so I think if you don't have those goals placed beforehand of like, okay, I'm going to try to get, this to happen against, X, Y, or Z, then it's, you really don't have any results.
Yeah. So it's always better to try and track what you're doing as clearly as possible, but with martial arts, it's difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And like I said, it needs to be as detailed as possible, because you need to be able to assess a grade on how well you did something.
Yeah. It's interesting that you brought that up, because a lot of instructors, if they get to the point where they write something down for like assessment purposes, they aren't very detailed. And when I started going through my master's degree program, I realized that was a real problem with objectivity to assessment. And one thing I tried to do, and I don't know if I succeeded at it, and I'll probably have to go back and revise it a lot, is I tried to actually boil down what are the most important aspects of a technique. In my case, I was teaching Taekwondo, so I'm trying to break down punches and kicks. And then what are the key details that I'm looking for that are going to keep you safe so you don't blow out your knee, and are going to hopefully maximize power. So, I'll say, okay, I want them to smoothly perform a round kick. And then I'll break down step by step what things I need to check off in order for it to count. So it's not just me eyeballing it. There's actually some rules, I guess you could say. There's actually like a rubric there. It's not perfect, but there are some things that you want to see from all of your students, like a pivot on the ball of the foot, a pivot that's within a range of degrees. You don't necessarily have to pivot an entire 160 degrees for a round kick, but somewhere around there, so you're not putting strain on the knee. And how smooth is the transition from chamber to kick? What surface are they using? Things like that.
Yeah, and that's I haven't done that yet for like the jiu-jitsu side as far as true assessment. But it is definitely something that I've kind of played with around as far as like trying to create spreadsheets of how to make that information more universal, if you will, like you said.
Yeah, which is always hard because I think you kind of alluded to this before. People kind of develop their own way of doing things, and even if it doesn't match up to the established formal version of it, sometimes it works. Right. And it's like, are you really correcting them if you're trying to make them do it a way that doesn't work for them? Or right. what counts, what's a non-negotiable and what has a range? That's very difficult. I haven't figured that out, so I haven't even begun to figure that out.
Yeah. No, it's, when you sit down and try to do it, it gets to be, very difficult on how you can assess that, because then you also have to include, this person's athletic ability just in general, and a couple other areas I feel like too. So.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm running out of time. So this is an awesome episode, and thank you for coming on.
Yeah, for sure. I enjoy it. Like I said, I've always kind of alluded to the fact that I definitely want more people to kind of try this method. It's definitely not where I feel it needs to be. I feel like it can get a lot better. And definitely if people have a lot more background in the learning side of things, I think it'll get better. And it's obviously the more that people do it, I think it'll get better. But I definitely know that there needs to be a change in the sport, because I think can be done so much better. And people allude to the fact that, well, there's world champions that that do it the same way, and I completely agree. I think obviously it's working for very committed folks, but I also think that there's probably even better ways for these students to be learning. So I want to try to figure that out as much as possible and make sure that it's not just the top people that are getting better, that everybody in that same, from the very 55-year-old grandma that wants to learn jiu-jitsu to the 20-year-old black belt stud that wants to learn and get better. I think everybody should be able to have a method in such a way to learn at everybody's best level, I guess, or best speed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I feel you there. I mean, there's almost no one in my life except for maybe two people that can even talk about motor learning, educational psychology, coaching science, any of that stuff that I can actually bounce ideas off of, compare notes. And I know how frustrating that is. And, we can develop the flipped classroom model a lot faster and a lot better if we have a collaborative community of instructors who are trying things out and comparing notes and bouncing ideas off each other, and each kind of developing their own practical and research knowledge base where they can trade techniques. And on the Combat Learning podcast, I definitely want to serve as a sort of call to action to people like, hey, listening to the podcast, do your own research, and let's start forming a network of instructors so we can get this stuff out here and really bring martial arts instruction out of the beginning of the 20th century and into the middle of the 21st century.
Yeah, for sure. And then the only other thing I'll say is that, like, if anybody else can figure out, because one of the problems that I run into as well is that I feel like class is very much it's like 75% instruction, but it's also 25% showmanship. And so one of the other problems that I think our style needs to address is the fact that, like, now that I don't have that, in front of everybody, I'll say, okay, here's an R bar, and then we're going to do this, and we can also do this, and that kind of like wow, or that showmanship that an instructor can have, that kind of goes away. And so I think that's one of the drawbacks. So I always try to allude to the fact that, this is not a perfect system. It's got its flaws, and the fact that, like, I think sometimes people come in, not only to learn, but also to be, that wow factor, a little bit of like, okay, I can turn an arm bar into a triangle, and a triangle into an omoplata, and omoplata into a back take, all that same stuff. And the showmanship that an instructor has, I feel like that with this system is lost a little bit. So.
Yeah, and that's actually a great point, that there is a legitimate motivational aspect to the instructor-led training. I feel like that probably diminishes the longer a student is with you, but it's definitely very important up front, especially if you're a new student. Yeah. And just sort of my offhand thoughts on that would be, maybe there is just one special introduction course, maybe not an ongoing class all the time, but when you kind of bring on board a bunch of new students, maybe you have like a 4 to 6 week period where you do more of a traditional classroom model, where you have some of that showmanship, you develop that relationship kind of up front, and then you use that period to kind of train them, wean them onto the flipped classroom model, so you can kind of, I guess, use that as a period to get buy-in and sell them on it. Sure. I don't know if that'll work, but that's just kind of my thoughts up front.
See, this is why we need more people doing this stuff, so that we can bounce these ideas off each other. So,
yeah.
But yeah, thank you very much.
For real. Thank you, man.
Guys, thank you so much for listening. If you have any feedback, you can email me at josh@combatlearning.com or send me a message on facebook.com/combatlearning. Now, real quick before I go, can I ask you a huge favor? If you got value from this episode, leave us a review on iTunes, Google Podcasts, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So many shows pop up and fizzle out. And we're talking about stuff that nobody else is talking about, and we want to stick around. So leaving us a review helps us a ton. Finally, the show is produced by Micah Peacock. Thanks in advance, and I'll see you on the next episode.